Um, okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. First of all, I have to ask, you see my screen? Does that work?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's actually, to me, it's a new group, so I'm really excited to see what's going on in this workshop. And I'm really happy to be able to present some thoughts and research results of relating to Holocene climate variability in this wider region that we're talking about, and potential impacts on cultural history. So I'm a geomorphologist from Heidelberg University. My name is Max Engel, and really it's an honor to give this presentation. It's split in half actually, to give it together with Helmut Brueckner, my former supervisor, who's based at the University of Cologne. So yeah, I start right away. This is a map of the current rainfall distribution in the wider region that we're focusing on. I have marked two sites, the site of Uruk. We're going to talk about Uruk later. That's going to be Helmut's part. And we also talk about research that we did on the oasis of Tama in Northern Arabia. What you can see and what you all know is is arid or hyper-arid area. We have very little rainfall. You see some climate diagrams here on the right. In Upper Mesopotamia, further in the north, we are roughly around 400 millimeters per year, and that actually is reduced to 150 in Lower Mesopotamia. That's considering the evaporation of 2,000 or 3,000 millimeters per year is very little. So another thing is not only there's a little amount of rainfall, there's also a great variability, interannual variability of rainfall, and also surface discharge in the large two rivers that you can see here. This is a frequency of annual occurrence of stream flow in between 1924 and 1946. And you can see there's a great variability in between 20 billions of cubic meters to 70 billions of cubic meters in terms of the Tigris. So the great variability is also a challenge. There is a significant correlation between winter rainfall, that is the main source of rainfall in this area, and the North Atlantic Oscillation that also drives the entire Mediterranean climate regime. And it not only drives winter rainfall in the panel C down below, you can also see that it controls, it's in phase, mostly in phase with stream flow of the two rivers. So stream flow and rainfall in the region are mainly controlled by the North Atlantic Oscillation. And that is again driven by two climate cells in Iceland and the Azores, but we're not going to go into detail there. So here is just an attempt to put this on the map. We have rainfall, the arrows indicate rainfall contributions by the Mediterranean regime for Mesopotamia, also for Northern Arabia. But it's also clear that in the wider region, there are some competing mechanisms of rainfall contributions that also include the East African summer monsoon and the Indian Ocean monsoon, and also other synoptical weather patterns such as tropical plumes in winter and spring. But what we can see here that the Mesopotamian heartland is mostly dominated by the Mediterranean winter rainfalls. So we talk about the present climate, but we also want to know about dynamics and variability in past climates. And for that, we need to look into geological records. We have a map here with some of the most prominent and established paleoclimate records that exist for this region. They're listed here on the right, such as Lake Van, in particular important for stream flow of the two rivers and also for Upper Mesopotamia climate. There's Jata Cave and Sora Cave, famous speleothem records, Lebanon and Israel in the very western part of this map. And I'm gonna talk about a record that is in the southwestern part of this map. Is an oasis called Tama in Saudi Arabia, where we have very recent results based on a paleo lake sediment record. And I'm going to talk about this in the next few minutes. So these paleoclimate archives in our region of interest mostly are lake sediments, represented by sediment cores that you can see here. This is just for a short explanation. On the left, you see the numbers. They refer to single sediment cores. And these sediment cores, we take them in overlapping segments. They are in 1 meter segments, as you can see here. And it's quite a complex work to puzzle them all together. It works, it does fit, but is some back and forth rearranging. And this is how they look like, the 1 meter segments in detail. And what you can see here is they are finely laminated. And in these laminations, we refer to them as varves. And varves indicate an annual layering in this former lake or wetland area. And it's always 2 couplets that represent 1 year. Another important climate archive is represented by speleothems, and these are also built up in layers and measuring certain element ratios or stable isotopes, stable isotope ratios in these singular layers also gives very important information about moisture availability. I'm not going to say much about the oasis of Tama. It was subjected to a large-scale archaeological excavation in the last almost 20 years. It has been frequented at least since the 7th-6th millennium BC. First monumental buildings like the city wall date into the 3rd millennium BC. And we had the unique opportunity to accompany the archaeological mission to investigate a geomorphic feature that's called the sapra. And the sapra is a topographic depression, the lowest part of the entire catchment. And you can see wadis debouching from the left, from west and from east, and also from the south. And they provide like ephemeral water and sediment to this depression and build up a sedimentary archive in this area. But the most peculiar finding that we made on our surveys were so-called bioclastic deposits. What's a bioclastic deposit? It's basically a sediment deposit that entirely or almost entirely consists of fossils. And in this case, it's shells of gastropods, of snails, shells of barnacles, like a crustacean that is sessile, immobile, that settles on rocks and hard substrates. And they are layered, as you can see here in the lower left, they are layered and dipping into the center, towards the center of the depression. And they were, in our interpretation, accumulated on a former shoreline of a former lake. And the fact that we find these crustaceans in their living position attached to the rock tells us that this is an in situ accumulation and not deposited and transported from somewhere else. So it's actually a testimony of a former permanent lake. On the map here, you can see the pink circles, and all these circles indicate locations where we found these former shoreline deposits, the bioclastic deposits. On the most important site in the northeast, you can see how this actually looks like. You can dig into it. It has a thickness of 2 to 3 meters. You can see here in the lower panel, you can see it's really almost entirely consisting of shells. In some parts, you can see even flow structures And also here, the barnacles in living position. We have dated it by C14. It dates to 10,000 to 9,000 before present. But now we actually know, now that we have other age models, we know that this is subject to the hard water effect. So it's definitely at least 1,500 years too old. Anyway, we can say it's definitely Holocene, and it accumulated very quickly. So based on the spatial distribution of these shoreline deposits, we can actually, and the digital elevation model, we can reconstruct a lake of approximately 20 square kilometers and a minimum depth of 30 meters in its peak conditions. So what we also did, we took sediment cores from the interior of this topographic depression to study the sediments that have accumulated and try to connect them to the shoreline deposits. This is the master core that I'm going to show you briefly. This is how it looked like where we actually took the cores. This is how the subcore looks like. It has salt and gypsum accumulated and precipitated at the surface. This is how it looks like when you dig into it and you see the beautifully conserved varves in the paleo lake sediments. So we measured a whole range of different parameters, geochemical parameters, micropaleontological proxies, in order to verify our lake hypothesis. This is just one. This is total organic carbon and is particularly elevated in the section of the core where we find these annually laminated varves. In the thin section on the right, you can see how they precisely look like, and they are actually couplets of siliciclastic sediment that is mostly sand and silt, fine sand and silt, and a white layer that is precipitated carbonate, precisely aragonite. So, and this tells us that we had, and both actually make up 1 year in the life cycle of the lake. So that tells us that we had probably a wet season where the wadis were activated. They provided sediment into a water body, into the existing lake. And in the water column, the coarser particles, they settled first and the finer particles come later. So they build up nice fining up sequences that indicate these processes. And in an arid, a very dry season, there's a lot of evaporation, no new water coming in. And at some point, carbonates start to precipitate from the water column and accumulate on the lake floor. So we can actually see in the core very distinct different sediment types. And those that I have been describing right now with the varves, they refer to number 3 and 4 in this picture. The x-axis here is the timeline. You can see up here, it's 9,250 to 7,500 before present is a very short timeline. And if we look at blue and green, 3 and 4, the peak phase of the lake with the laminated sediments is only like 600 years. And so we believe that the life cycle of this lake was in a permanent lake state was probably only 600 years. And after that, it rapidly transitioned into an ephemeral wetland, indicating much drier conditions, which are also indicated by the thin section in the orange panel, clastic evaporitic lamination that shows accumulation of secondary gypsum, which is always associated with desiccation of a water body. We have also measured a couple of other proxies, that is stable isotopes, oxygen and carbon, and also deuterium. And they also refer to parameters like rainfall, productivity, biological productivity, and evaporation. And we can see that in sections 3 and 4, we have the least evaporation, we have the highest bioproductivity, and the highest rainfall indicators. This is not a singular finding. We find these lake deposits in the entire basin, and this is a section of sediment cores from south to north, left to right. And you can see throughout this basin, we find these lake deposits. So what do we do with these timelines and these proxies? So we compare them with other climate proxies in the wider region. In the center, the diagram D is the climate proxy of this study, and you see it's very short, looking at the timeline below and above this diagram. So we only have a peak humid phase of about 600 years, in between 7,900 and maybe 8,550. And while in other records, the so-called early to mid Holocene humid period that also refers to North Africa and Arabia is much longer and mostly postulated to be like 10,000 to 6,000 years before present. So the bottom line here is that even though many of these records are in phase, in overlap, there are definitely regional and sub-regional differences, as there are some competing atmospheric processes that actually create the climate in this wider region. And yeah, I hand over to Helmut, who's gonna present his results of his research from Uruk.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So next slide, please. I will talk about Uruk. And in this audience, of course, I need not tell much about Uruk. You see the Uruk tell in the background of the photo. And yeah, it is known that this was the birthplace of writing, the invention of the brewing of beer, which is also not unimportant, and the city of the legendary king Gilgamesh. And on the right hand, you see the different cores which we have done in the city. This was on the invitation of Margarethe van Es, who is now the director of the Orient department of the DAI. So I will show you some results of these corings. Next slide. Yeah, this is Uruk 1. This is the master core, so to speak, and you see it goes deep down. And from that, we can see the different phases of the environmental changes. The lowermost part we interpret as Holocene dune formations. I will come to this in a minute. Then comes an alluviation, so obviously the deltas are prograding. Then comes a transgressive phase, which is a freshwater marsh. I will also talk about this in a minute. And then come all of the history of the urban history, 5,000 years of this mega city of Uruk. But also already in this marshy deposit, in this lower deposit, the freshwater wetlands, we find already traces of the humans. Next slide. But when we talk about this, this is of course interesting to see how was sea level, how was the Holocene transgression. And we see it on the right hand from a reconstruction by Puls. But this is from Qatar, and he has a peak about 7,500 before present, but this is probably too old. As you see in the model, which is the reddish and the blue line, you see the peak is later. And this confirms also what we have seen. Next slide. Because we worked on Qatar, and there we see that the peak is about 5,500 before today. And this is based on shells in situ, on living position actually, and on coral, which we found there. So this is quite a good constraint. And if we look at the next slide, then we see that indeed this peak has also been seen in Dosaria in Saudi Arabia, where you have the settlement before. Yeah, you have a lot of radiocarbon ages of the settlement, but then the settlement stops. Excuse me. And this is probably because sea level rose and people get, so to speak, wet feet. It turns into an island and they have to leave. So the peak is about 5,500 before today. And the next slide shows us the reconstruction which Jennifer Purnell, who will be presenting later today, had in her PhD. And here you see the yellow arrow. it seems that the transgression goes just up to Uruk. And when you look in all of our drill cores, the bottom part is this greenish stuff, and this is definitely not marine. It is in what we call sand, which is homogeneous, it is sterile, so we consider this a dune sand. Next slide. Yeah, we put this together here again, and but that's okay. So we think that we have not found in any of these cores definitely marine conditions, but we found this where there is the green peak, the transgression peak. And we think when the sea level rises, of course, the groundwater table also rises, and this brings the transgression of the wetlands. So this corresponds to the high sea level, but in Uruk itself, below the tell, there is no marine stratigraphy. Next slide. And this was done, you can click through now, this was done by geomagnetics by Helmut and Jörg Fassbinder, who will always present later. And you have these canals, what they interpreted as canals. And we see this also on the cylinder seal. Yes, there were canals there, and it was reconstructed. Please, the next slide, where you see these marshy conditions given to me by Margarete van Es, this picture, how people lived there. So this makes sense, but it was still the question, are they really canals? And so we drilled inside, and what did we find? We found in the canals definitely erosional disconformity at the base of the canals. We found small pieces of rolled ceramics. We found the freshwater fauna, which is in freshwater. And we found that the canal bottom is where the water comes into the city, is a bit higher than where it outflows. So definitely we can confirm this were canals where the water was diverted into the city. And this was already seen also on aerial photographs. And when you then map it, as it is done on the right-hand side, you see that the canals went through the city, but also outside when you go into the fields. And this is shown on the next slide, because you see the, what we call inverted channels or inverted canals. Now the channel fill is higher than the fields because the wind took it away, but the channels are cemented by calcium carbonate, so they are well visible, and we see root pseudomorphs of palm trees and so on. And in the next slide, we see that is Unio tigridis. So this is obviously, they also had water basins where they could harvest these mollusk shell. So I come to the conclusion, synopsis. Max has shown you the record about Tama, which is about around the 8.2 kilo-year peak that we have the sea, the lake there, and we have the grasslands also, which is nicely shown by palynologists. And the next slide is a synopsis. Of course, I cannot go into details, but it shows in the north, the humid period is much longer and the aridization is in the south. So we have our final bullet points. Oh no, this is first before that. Important for the civilizations are, of course, the dry periods. And the dry periods are indicated here with these yellow arrows. And we see that there is a dry period around 5.2. Rapid climate change event, RCC is the rapid climate change event, which would be about 3,200 before Christ or before Common Era, and the 4.2 rapid climate change event. And this is where we see an effect on the civilizations there indeed. So we summarize in Lower Mesopotamia. In the Neolithic, we have a semi-nomadic subsistence lifestyle under stable, more humid climate conditions, which we have seen in the record of Tama. Then we have a gradual aridization during the Ubaid time, the settlement clusters. We find social reorganization and economic differentiation. And we have the sea level rise now and transgressive wetlands during the Ubaid time. The wetlands are then used as transport pathways and as a source for food, hunting, fishing, to counter the aridity which is coming, the rainfall deficit, so to speak. We have a population growth on the other hand, and the aridity during the Uruk time, so irrigation agriculture is needed. You have seen the inverted channels there, irrigated horticulture, I would call that. And during the late Uruk time, the impact of the 5.2 rapid climate change event can be seen on the irrigation culture, agriculture, and on the further concentration in urban centers. And finally, There is a further aridization with the pulse of 4.2 rapid climate change or 2200 BCE, which coincides with reduced crop yields, politically instable situations, salinization of the fields, and finally migration. Our last slide, we want to thank the Orient Department of the German Archaeological Institute, who helped us for many years, Dr. Margarete van Es, Ricardo Eichmann, and Arnulf Hausleiter. Thank you very much for your attention.